when I served as Director of Development at a local Kansas City nonprofit for 5 years. I have been in the seat that many of you find yourself currently sitting in. I know the day in, day out of nonprofit ministry development, and I know it can be equal parts challenging and rewarding. What I loved most about the work I did in development was getting to see God's people connect with the work that He was doing in our community. Ministry folks get the privilege to see that work day in and day out and to be an active participant. But the donors or ministry partners are what enables it to happen. And you, as development officers, advancement coordinators, executive directors, and presidents, often get to be a part of that happening. What a joy and a privilege to sit in the seat in which you find yourself. Honored today to host this webinar to help provide you with another tool for your development toolbox to help grow your organization's development strategy. Doug Baus joins us today. He is Vice President of Client Services with Money for Ministry. He works with ministry clients, both large and small, coaching, serving, and developing their legacy gift programs. Prior to joining Money for Ministry, he served as a pastor for 14 years, and he helped with stewardship campaigns, coaching ministry teams, mentoring interns, and teaching. He and his wife and 3 daughters live in Michigan. Before I turn this over to Doug, I do have a couple of housekeeping details I want to be sure you are all aware of. First of all, I want to make this a conversation. I know you're busy. I know you have a lot going on and many priorities pressing into your day. So I want to make sure that today, that this hour is valuable to you. If you have questions, please ask them. I have previewed this information and I know it's valuable and I do believe it's relevant, but I want you to feel comfortable asking questions as you have them. Don't save them up for the end or wonder about them later. When you look at your screen, you'll see a Q&A tab at the bottom toolbar. Just type in your question there, click on that Q&A tab, type in your question, and we will do our very best to answer those as we go. Now, obviously, we may not be able to answer them all. Whatever questions we don't get to, we will either answer at the end or we will reply to an email or include that answers in an email following the webinar. And we'll distribute those to all of you. I think that covers the housekeeping pieces, the introduction of myself and of course then our speaker, Doug. So I think we're ready. Doug, are you ready? We're excited to learn from you this morning.
Awesome. Thank you, Kristen. It is really a delight and a pleasure to be invited to do this and to share with you. As Kristen mentioned, I spent 14 years in parish ministry, and one of the things that over the 14 years that was always consistent for us was what I would sometimes call the fragility of the ministry. You try to plan, and we certainly did, but there was always also this sense that if we missed a week's offering, we could be in some serious trouble. So the idea of fundraising and creating long-term sustainability for the ministry is something that has always been in my heart and something that I want to see happen. And especially today, as we talk about climbing to the top of the fundraising mountain, especially as it pertains to planned giving, have some thoughts here about that, and I'm excited to share them with you. So let's dive in. As Kristen mentioned, I'm with Money for Ministry, and sometimes people think, where does that name come from? We actually started as a fundraising newsletter, about 15 years ago. But Mike, our president and founder, had been reflecting as he went through some of his work on the need for planned gift ministry and development, and especially as it pertained to the story he likes to tell was as a fresh out of college development director at a small Christian school in northern Michigan. And they said to him, hey, there's a ministry in the big city just over the hill over there, and they do an auction every year. Find out what they're doing because they bring in a lot of money. And so Mike very beautifully went over and talked to him and got some tips. And the main thing they told him was, you need to have an open bar, and that will bring the money in and keep it flowing. And as Mike went back to his small Christian school, much more rural than the city he had, this auction was being held in, he thought, yeah, I just don't know if that's going to work. But in any case, he went along and put a lot of hours and time into creating this auction event and brought in $30,000. They were very excited. They were very happy. It was a success. It was what they had hoped for. And then about a week later, the superintendent of the school system showed him a letter from an attorney that they had just received 2 legacy gifts, each of them worth $50,000. And Mike said to himself, you know, I worked my tail off for months to pull this auction off. I didn't do anything, and those legacy gifts came in. How do we get more of those? And that began the journey that we've been on as Money for Ministry for these last 15 years. And you can see we serve a lot of clients all over the country, large and small. But in everything, our heart is really to see the kingdom grow. We only serve Christian nonprofits because that's really at the core of who we are. I use the theme here of climbing the fundraising mountain because I like to think I'm a fairly adventurous guy. I've climbed a few mountains in my life. We call them 14ers. If you're familiar with that, it's not the kind of mountains where you climb with ropes and carabiners, but you can hike to the top of a number of 14ers. Those are mountains over 14,000 feet. But about 8-9 months ago, my wife and I were flipping through Netflix and found this documentary on the ascent of Mount Meru. And that's what you see here. It's a mountain. You're looking at the picture on the left. It's called the Shark's Fin. It's considered one of the most technical climbs in the entire world. In 2008, it was attempted by the gentleman on the right, and he and his 3 fellow climbers did not make it. In 2011, they ascended it for the very first time. But I have to tell you, this is in India. It's a very technical climb. I look at the guys over there on the right with their hanging in that, I don't know what you call that, bivouac-y looking thing off the side of a mountain, and it makes my palms sweat. It really does. And I think to myself, this is not for me. I like to hike up mountains, but to climb up mountains straight up like this is just, it's just, no thank you. I just can't do it. And unfortunately, we hear this a lot when it comes to planned giving, because for so many people, the idea of planned giving, it's this monster that you feel like you have to tackle. It's this mountain you have to ascend, and it just makes your palms sweat. In fact, we had one gift rep say to us, I never bring up planned giving in the donor conversation. This could be a director, a president. I never bring this up because, frankly, I'm afraid the donor might be interested, and he just didn't know where to go with it. But my hope today is really to help you see that there is a way to do this that doesn't require you to be an expert, but each one of you can do it. I'm going to talk a little bit about Mount Whitney as part of the story here. Anybody, we have this question and answer. I'm not sure exactly, but Mount Whitney, does anybody know what Mount Whitney is known for? It's located in the lower 48. It has the distinction of being, and if you happen to know the answer, feel free to type it in as a question. I'd love to see if anybody happens to know. It is a 14er. You can see that here by what you're looking at. It's 14,505 feet above sea level when you reach the top. I'm not seeing any answers come in, so I will just tell you, just making sure I'm looking in the right place here. But Mount Whitney is the highest peak in the lower 48. So there are a number of what we call, again, 14ers, but none of them stretch higher. Another little known fact about Mount Whitney, at the portal, at the base of Mount Whitney, are the Alabama Hills. And you may or may not know what the Alabama Hills are, but have you ever watched The Lone Ranger? The show, that black and white TV show from, I'm not even going to try to guess what decade it's from because I'll probably get it wrong, but the Lone Ranger was filmed in the Alabama hills at the base of Mount Whitney. But what you're looking at here is what, again, we call the mountaineer's route to climbing to the top of Mount Whitney. It's pretty direct. It's pretty straight. It's relatively short, although, of course, you have to climb. But I made an attempt at Mount Whitney in 2003, and I took the hiker's route. It's 22 miles round trip, 11 miles one way, but you can see here, it looks flat. It's not exactly flat, but if you can see my cursor here, that mountaineer's route I was showing you earlier goes right about there. That's the mountaineer's route. It just goes like that. But of course, if you have a good map and plan ahead, and you take the hiker's route, you can actually do this in a day. 22 miles is a bit of a stretch, but it can be done. And as we talk again about climbing the mountain of planned giving, I'll explain to you a little bit how I see that working. Now, I do have a question here, and I would like, if you could, again, to enter in the question and answer part here. The question is, what is the tallest mountain in the world? And I'm guessing you've, and don't be afraid to take a guess, take a shot at it, type it in here, what you might think that would be. I can give you some. Somebody says Mount Everest. Yes, I would expect to see that. That is definitely in the category that we're going to be talking about today. Anybody else? There's Mount McKinley in Alaska. There are other, K2 might be a mountain. Oh, I see them coming in now on the, yes, K2, Everest. Some of you are putting it in the chat. That's fine. Others in the question section. I see them both. So that's great. So those are all wonderful guesses. Of course, as any, you're probably guessing he's going to trick us here, and I am to a degree. Those are all, well, let me just say this. Mount Everest is the highest mountain in the world. It truly is. But it is, in fact, not the tallest. And this is where it becomes a trick question. The tallest mountain in the world, Mount Mauna Kea, located in Hawaii, is a volcano. It is 33,000 feet tall, but as you can see here by the picture, 13,000 of it is above sea level. So it reaches 13,000 feet into the sky. The remaining 20,000 feet is underwater. And when we talk about planning, the reason this is applicable to our conversation today, what we find, and in the organizations that we work with, you have potentially hundreds or even thousands of donors that are on your file already, that when they include you in their will, can make their largest gift ever. And we often call these your hidden major donors. They're probably not on a major gift list. You may not know who they are. They're probably giving you $5 a month or $100 a year, but they have been with you for 10, 15, or maybe 20 years. They love what you do, and they are consistent and loyal, faithful givers. And what a lot of these donors don't even realize is that they could include you in their will, and when they do, they have the ability to make their largest gift ever. I said we sometimes call them your hidden major donors. Sometimes we call them your widow's mite donors. Maybe you recall the story that Jesus tells of the widow who gave everything she had. And Jesus really upholds her as the hero of New Testament giving. That her heart shows that Jesus is number one, and in doing so, she gives it all away. It's a pretty amazing story. But we really want to help you think about today who these folks are and how you can uncover them and how you can have a conversation with them. So we're going to talk about the 5 ways to climb the fundraising mountain, and there'll be 5 steps to this. The first is to find a guide, because a guide has the ability to give you some perspective on what this climb is going to be like. And let me talk to you a little bit about perspective. When we think about planned giving, maybe about 20 years ago, in the late 90s, there were a group of researchers from Boston College University who said something big is coming. The largest wealth transfer in human history, as baby boomers retire and eventually pass away, there will be this enormous transfer of wealth from one generation to the next. And in about 1998, they pegged that at $41 trillion that would be changing hands. Now, since then, of course, we had the Great Recession of 2008. But about 2 years ago, they revised their numbers. And not only had it recovered, but it had grown some more. They're now pegging this wealth transfer at 59 trillion. That number is almost too big to wrap your mind around. Think about it like this: if you were able to spend $10 million a day, it would take you over 16,000 years to spend that much money. Most of us won't see $10 million in our lifetime, let alone in a day. I see some questions that are coming in. Do we find that 20 and 30 somethings give in the same way as older faithful donors who are age 50 and above? That's a great question, and I'm going to keep these questions in mind as we go. I think the short answer is that no, they don't. In fact, I was at a conference about a month ago, and the speaker was saying that it doesn't even so much matter what generation you're talking about, but as donors age, their giving starts to become more institutional and more consistent and more regular. So 30 years ago, we were talking about boomers, and we were talking about how they didn't give in the same way that the builders did. So my recommendation here is to hang tight and to wait for these donors, because I think they will become more like the donors we see today. Of course, there's always change from one generation to the next. Great question. Thank you. So 59 trillion. So it's just an enormous amount of money. And we think there's opportunity here for charities of all sizes to get in on this. Another part of finding a guide and the idea of perspective is to think about the potential that these legacy donors have. When I say legacy donors, that's just another term for thinking about those donors who, in addition to their regular giving, have also included you in their will. Two important things happen when a donor includes you in their will. One, of course, is the gift that's coming later, and it can't come soon enough for some of us. I say that a little bit tongue-in-cheek because we realize that these are real people with real lives who are invested in our ministry. They love us and we love them. So the idea that they have to pass away for us to receive their money causes us a little bit of concern, or a lot of concern. But that's part of it, right? And we know that that gift is coming, and that's something that we have in mind when we're asking for that gift. But what we often don't realize is that not only is that gift coming at some point in the future, but it's also true that their giving today goes up. In fact, Russell James, one of the leading planned gift researchers through his work in conjunction with the Lilly School of Philanthropy, did a longitudinal study over 16 years and said, on average, with good cultivation, the giving today, in other words, what they're giving to your annual fund, what they're giving to those donors, what they're giving to your appeals right now is on average twice that of the rest of your file. So to me, it's really an indication to say, we want to find out who these folks are to the best we can and pay attention to them so that we can steward them appropriately. So we can, again, begin to see some of that 2x giving today.
Hey, Doug, it's Kristen.
Yeah.
Can I interrupt for just a second?
Absolutely.
I'm interested with the question that Marvin poses about the 20 and 30 somethings and relating to these two different populations. And I know that's something really development folks struggle with, is how do I talk to my older, perhaps donors who are more, they're the ones that come to mind when I think about legacy gifts. And then I've got these younger, 20, 30-year-old folks that are just really starting to hit their stride as far as getting involved in a nonprofit. When do I start that conversation with folks? When is it too early? So surely that, I mean, we certainly know that that legacy gift is much farther away for those that younger generation. But is it appropriate to begin planting those seeds even now as they are in that younger age group?
Thank you, Kristen, for bringing that up. The average age for a first gift in the will is age 49. And that's important to pay attention to. You raise a good point, right? We're trying to talk to, we think older donors and wealthier donors when we think planned giving. But it's actually true that people, again, around about age 49, kids are starting to grow up. Career is maybe a little bit more settled. Things are more certain. And suddenly there's this opportunity that they begin to think, hey, I could do this. So it's not too early in your late 40s to be asking about this. And then, of course, the benefit to the charity is that once they've included you in their will, and I ask this question all the time, why do you think their giving would go up? Why would it be? Sometimes people will say to me, well, if people put me in their will, that's their excuse so they don't have to give now. When in fact, the research is just the opposite. It says they give more. And I think that bears itself out. If you think about what it means to put someone in your will, it's like they've become one of your heirs. And now you're invested in their future in a new way. So I'm always encouraging charities to not exclude, and we're certainly talking about older in the sense that we're probably not talking about 20 and 30-year-olds, but 40, 50, 60, and of course 70 and 80-year-olds, absolutely.
Great, thank you.
All right, yeah. We're talking about Find the Guide here. And we talk about perspective and I want to talk a little bit about the motivation for a legacy gift. I think sometimes the default when it comes to planned giving is that we start to think about complicated tax planning. And for many, many years, what a lot of charities, and we did this in the church that I was in as well, was to say, let's get some attorneys together and let's put on a planned giving seminar for how to structure your estate. Now, I want you to hear me here. There's a lot of helpful information that you can learn from these. I mean, just something as simple as using an IRA as a charitable gift is a very tax-efficient way to do it because IRAs are taxed when they're passed on, unlike when they're given to a charity. So there's lots of wonderful things you can gain from having these kinds of seminars. But I suspect, and be curious to hear from those here, how many of you have tried something like that, a planned giving seminar, and struggled to get people to show up? Or maybe how many of you have tried to build a website that's packed full of information, calculators, tips, and tricks? But if you ever take the time to dig into the traffic that you're seeing on that website, you find out, wow, people just aren't really going here. They're not using this material in the way that we'd hoped. We've actually, through our work, surveyed thousands of legacy prospects and donors, and what we found is that donors aren't motivated by tax savings. They're not even motivated by the heart of your cause. So if you're a Christian school, they're not motivated by Christian education. If you're a church planting ministry, that's not their primary motivation, I should say. Their primary motivation when it comes to leaving a legacy is what we call the worship motivation. We find that donors are interested in passing on their values to their kids and grandkids. They're more interested in saying things like, God has blessed me and I want to give back. In fact, I had a development director call me once. He said, you'll never believe this. I had a phone call with a 96-year-old donor, and I was thanking her for a gift she had just made. I ended up leaving a message. She called me back about an hour later, and on no uncertain terms, she wanted me to know that I don't give because of all the statistics you send me and the impact that you claim to have. I give because God's blessed me, and this is my way of saying thanks. He just had to chuckle. It made him laugh. He called me. He said, I got to share this story with you because he said, it's so true. And especially when it comes to the legacy conversation, we find that donors are when they're thinking legacy, they're thinking long-term, and they're thinking vision, and they're thinking about the kind of impact they can make on the next generation. And so we like to say, if you want to ask about legacy, ask about people's values, what they hope to pass on, what their kids and grandkids are talking about. We say people want to talk about their values before they're ready to talk about their valuables. And so for us, we call it a faith and family approach, as opposed to what might be more traditionally thought of as a terminology and techniques approach. Talk to your donors about what they value. Talk to them about their faith. That's a much more fruitful place to begin the conversation.
Hey, Doug, we've had a question come across that I feel like correlates with what you're saying right now, and that is, if my ministry population is an older population, so if I'm in the business of serving seniors, is it appropriate or even ethical to approach them as not only being the ones served, but potentially being those legacy donors as well? And so I just wonder what your perspective is on that as it relates to what you just shared, and that this is really a values conversation. So is that person who's receiving the benefit of the ministry actually also a potential legacy giver or donor?
Is it appropriate to ask them, you mean, or is it appropriate if they're one of your constituents? I guess I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think that's really what the question is. That's really what the question is that if I'm serving the senior population and they're obviously receiving value from this ministry, is that also an opportunity, not in every case, I'm sure, but in some cases, to engage them in this legacy gift conversation?
I mean, absolutely, I would say. And I don't mean to kind of glibly answer the question, but I think actually some of the clients that hospice and senior care facilities have some of the largest planned giving programs, and it makes sense. I mean, you've been served well and the family sees this. The mom and dad have been served well at the end of life at a time when the family needed lots of help. And those ministries, they receive large legacy gifts, have some of the biggest pipelines that we know of. Now, the question I suppose you want the follow-up to that is, how do you do that? And if I can defer to keep going here, because I think I'm going to unpack some things that will help us think about how to do that. But absolutely, is that awesome. Am I answering the question, Kristen?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's right on. Yep, thank you.
All right. We're going to talk about so we talked about finding a guide. We're going to talk about making a checklist here as we proceed through this. So of course, if you're going to go on a hike, if you're going to go camping, if you're going on a vacation, you're probably going to make a list before you leave about what you need to take and how you're going to go about it. And I mentioned earlier that I attempted to summit Mount Whitney in 2003. And I was going to share a little bit about this. My buddy Paul, he's a good friend of mine, and he and I said, let's do this together. And Paul put himself in charge of food for the trip. Now, I don't want you to think, I got this picture of Cocoa Puffs up here, and I got to tell you, so Paul's he's a mule of a guy. And just to give you an example of that, one time our families were hiking together. He has 3 kids. I have 3 kids. They were all quite little at the time. He had one in a backpack carrier. It was a frame pack. So he had another standing on the frame of the pack and was hanging on to his sister, who was in the pack. And then he put his 3rd child on the front of him, basically, you know, hugging her and carrying her that way in that position. And he went for a mile up the mountain. He chugged along like this for over a mile. So Paul is no slouch. But Paul's also the kind of guy who likes to down a bag of Oreos in one sitting. And he was packing food for the trip, and he grabbed a box of Cocoa Puffs for dinner the night before. I remember we were going to do this in one day. We got up at 2 in the morning. We had Cocoa Puffs for dinner the night before. We were going to go 11 miles up, 11 miles down. And I got to tell you, I got about 2/3 of the way up, and I ran out of gas. I couldn't do it. And I fell asleep on the side of the mountain for 2 hours. Paul actually continued, and he made it. He summited that day. But he said to me, "We got to get you up there." So a year later, we made another trip, and this time we did a little bit more planning. We had a few more people involved, and of course you can see this was 2003, and my camera didn't have the same pixels that it has today, so we're a little grainy. But that's me over there. We said we're going to do it in 2 days. We're going to spend a night on the mountain, and I said, "Paul, I'm in charge of food, and we're going to eat pasta." You've heard of eat pasta, run pasta. We're going to eat pasta, and we're going to do it. And we did. We made it to the top. You can see we're approaching the summit there on the left, and that's looking down into the valley on the right. We did it. So I want to talk just for a little bit about, we made some plans on that second attempt. I want to talk about some planning that you can do as you're thinking about a legacy, climbing to the top of a legacy gift mountain. What are some things to think about? The first would be a leadership readiness. Maybe you are the director, the president. Maybe you are the leader. Maybe you work for the leader. But is this a priority in the work that you do? It's so easy to say that plan giving is important, but I just don't have time for it. And I get it. I've been in that ministry setting, and you think it's just one more thing. Part of what I want to show you today is how you can integrate it into what you're already doing. So it doesn't have to be one more thing, but it can be part of that. Are you willing to credit gifts accordingly? Even if you are the one who's making all the asks, you're the director, you're the president. Are you showing results to your board, to your team? Are you saying, look, we uncovered 10 legacy gifts in the last 2 years. That's going to have an amazing impact on our ministry for generations to come. So are you counting them? Are you giving credit for them? If you're doing a campaign and you're making an ask and a donor pledges $10,000 to the campaign and they tell you that they've included the ministry in their will, are you sharing that? Are you letting people know that that matters? Because that's an important part of making sure your legacy program is growing and people are joining it. So leadership readiness.
Hey, Doug, before you move on to this, I just want to echo what you said. I think what you're kind of alluding to is this culture of these legacy gifts, and I really think that's a fantastic recommendation, just that you're keeping your board aware and your other staff people, because you just never know where those conversations may happen and who has connections with whom. And just to know that this is a part of our strategy to continue to grow our ministry is something that those closest to the ministry just need to be aware of. So it's on their radar screen, and that naturally makes them more ready. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. And yes, thank you for saying it even better. And what it triggered for me too, I think as a leader, if you are the leader or have a close connection, even just legacy giving is so connected to your vision for the future. Where do you see the ministry in 5 years, in 10 years? What's your plan? And I'm guessing if you're the director, if you're the lead person, you have lots of opportunities to share that vision with your constituents, with your donors. And that's also a wonderful time to say, and by the way, would you ever consider including us in your will? Because people who are including you in their will are looking for that kind of assurance about the future, that confidence that you have a plan. If you hope to be there for 20 years, tell them you hope to be there for 20 years, because that will, if you're about to retire, give them a plan for what the succession is going to look like so they can see that you're looking ahead to that you've got a plan in place. Because it's those kinds of conversations that give legacy donors the confidence to take action. Or I should say, they give legacy prospects the confidence to take action. All right, love it. I gotta make sure I'm on track here, Kristen, but let me keep going. Donor development. How old is your file? And by how old, I mean, how old is your ministry? Do you have donors that have been on file for 5 years or more? Do you have long-time, loyal, faithful donors? Do you have a lot of monthly donors who've been giving to you for many, many years? If you're, I'll just be frank, if your ministry is less than 5 years old, you might not be ready to talk a lot about planned giving because you just don't have that longevity that legacy donors are looking for. Team readiness. We've kind of touched on this before, earlier, but let me just say a minute about, sometimes some of you might be thinking, this is great. If only I had a planned giving expert on my team. Or if you're really small, you might even be thinking, if only I just had a development director, or if only the development director I had was full-time and not, I'm not asking her to do, or him to do 3 other things at the same time. Actually, if that's your situation, I think you're in a pretty good spot. We recommend that we don't, that you don't put planned giving. I like to say, you say planned giving is at extension 3, and then you can say, wipe your brow and say that's covered. But we really want to see is that there's a whole team, the people who open the checks, the person who answers the phone, the people who are talking to donors, the folks who are leading programs, that they all have an awareness that someone can simply leave a gift in their will and it can have a tremendous impact on your ministry. So that when you hear donors say things like, I wish I could give more, or I'm on a fixed income, I would love to give more, that, did you know that a lot of people like you have been able to impact lives for generations to come by thinking about a gift in their will? Something as simple as that can be a great way to plant the seed for a legacy gift. Kristen, I see questions coming in, and I'm just going to trust that when you see one that you want to address, that you will interrupt me, because I also want to try to stay on track with where we got to get to today. So
yep, I think you're right on, Doug.
All right. Lastly, we just want to talk about budget readiness, and we often hear, and as you all probably hear, it takes money to raise money. It really is just about setting aside staff time and money to do it effectively. Doesn't have to be a big time commitment, especially when it's integrated into what you're already doing. And that's what we're gonna move to that here next. So the checklist, find a guide, and now we're gonna move here. We make a check, find a guide, make a checklist, and number 3, we want to talk about building awareness. I'm going to talk about what's a pretty classic marketing funnel where we see, and I've seen this in the charities we work with, most donors go through 3 steps on their way to including you in their will. First, they need to be aware that they can do this. Once they're aware, there's going to be certain folks who are expressing interest, and you want to think about how to have a conversation with them. And finally, some folks are going to ultimately take action, and you want to have a plan for how to steward those who've taken action. Let's start here with awareness. 40 years of research from planned giving professionals shows that for every 1 gift that you know about, where a donor said, hey, by the way, just so you know, we've included you in our will, that there are very likely another 5 who have taken action and not told you. We call these your private donors. And frankly, you need a way to talk to them. The people who will never tell you that they've done it. Maybe you've experienced this where we call them manna gifts. All of a sudden you open the mail one day and there's a letter from an attorney. You've been included in someone's estate plan, and here's the first installment. I mean, those are days when you're jumping in the aisles or jumping in the hallways and dancing and saying, thank you, Jesus. How can we make more of that happen? And one of the ways is to have a program that makes your donors aware that this is even a possibility. A lot of your wealthier donors probably know that, But if you recall, we're also talking about those hidden major donors, those under the radar, those widow's mite donors who wouldn't even think about this as a possibility. But they can do this. They might not have a huge estate, but they have assets. They own a house. They have life insurance. One director shared with me not too long ago. He said, it was a ministry update lunch. We were sharing highlights. We were giving thanks to God for the wonderful things he was doing in our ministry. And at the end, I said, hey, by the way, a lot of people just like you in the last couple of years have made a gift to us in their will. And I can't tell you what an impact that's having on us now and it will have in the future. And someone came up to him afterwards and said, I didn't know that you received those kind of gifts. And he was blown away because he says to me, he says, Doug, of course we receive them. We take gifts of all kinds. Who wouldn't? But for this donor, it was a question of awareness.
Doug, we've had a question just come up that says, really asks the question, we have almost 40% of the people that this particular ministry works with, as far as a donor perspective, they don't even have wills. So we're dealing with this population that should be considering a legacy gift, could be considering a legacy gift, but they haven't even taken the step for themselves personally to prepare a will. What is the role of the ministry leader in that conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. We talk a lot about serving, not selling. You can serve the donors with information. One of the things we do is we help you write a brochure that, people think writing a will, the reason people don't have a will is because they think it's too expensive and they think it's complicated. And one of the things we need to help our donors realize is it's not as expensive as you think, and it's not as complicated as you think. And just some simple information about how to include a charity in your will, how to update your will. You can, a simple brochure to that effect, something on your website with tips. Now this is all, we help charities write this stuff all the time. But we just talk about, most donors we say are self-served. They have an attorney, they have the ability, or they have someone they know that they're going to go to, so they don't need you to, make a referral necessarily. They're probably not looking for that. They don't need you to, provide them with a lot of, again, tax help. What they need is a little inspiration and a little motivation, and just a sense. In fact, donors will cite the number one reason for a charitable gift in the will was the charity's materials. In other words, the charity sharing their vision, their impact. What you're looking at right now is an example of something like that. This is a way to build awareness. The article there says, why wait until you're gone to impact the ones you love? Again, this is what we call a faith and family approach. We're looking to write material that speaks to the donor's heart, that speaks to their worship motivation, that speaks to this desire, again, here in this case, to impact them. And we're integrating this into a newsletter that you're probably doing anyway. We're not creating special pamphlets on charitable gift annuities and on residual trust and lead trust and all that kind of stuff. We're just really trying to get your donors thinking about their future and about how they can make an impact. That's a great question. Love it. I want to say anything else, but I also want to keep moving. So again, Kristen, interrupt me if there's a follow-up to that. But we also see awareness working really well on like a reply device. For a free copy of your special bulletin, 4 keys to finding rest. Again, this is targeted to people who wouldn't even be thinking about a gift in the will. And what are the 4 keys to finding rest in a chaotic world? I want to find out about that. Well, one of them might be finding rest, might be leaving a gift in your will to your favorite charity as a way to help your kids and grandkids know what you value and where your heart is. So there's just lots of little ways to integrate this into what you're already doing. On your website, now, I often find web pages, there's so many different, maybe you've got something on other ways to give and it's buried on your web page. and maybe you've called it our planned giving page. Sometimes these pages are filled with lots of gift calculators and fancy tools. A couple thoughts on that. Most people don't know what planned giving means. In fact, the term planned giving scores about 15 to 20 points lower than something as simple as make a gift in your will or leave a legacy. So if you take only one thing away from today, it's as simple as this: go find that link on your webpage that says planned giving and change it to say make a gift in your will or leave a legacy. You've at least got people more inclined to click it, because people don't know what planned giving means. It's scary. It's intimidating. It's like trying to climb up Mount Meru straight up the face. The other thing to keep in mind here is that 85 to 90% of all planned gifts are a simple gift in the will. And most donors get that. They have at least some sense of what that is. So if you focus all your marketing efforts on a gift in the will, you're hitting the vast majority of your donors. And I would encourage you to make that the focus, again, of what's on your webpage. You can put fancy calculators on there and tools and things like that. But I'd challenge you to take a look at the traffic you're seeing there. If it's working, great. But I suspect it's probably not getting the kind of traffic you'd hoped for. All right. We're going to shift here from awareness to interest. And when we're thinking about interest, two things that are important here that I'd like to highlight. One is that we want it to be a dialogue. A lot of times charities will make this a monologue or a one-off kind of thing. Legacy gifts are triggered by life events. So all your fundraising, you might plan events, direct mail appeals. There's all kinds of things that you do on your calendar. But think about when you last updated your will. Maybe it was when your kids moved out of the house, or when there was a change in your marital status, or a change in your health, change in your finances. These are the reasons we finally decide to spend the money and meet with an attorney, or we get off, we get going and we get moving on this. It's really hard otherwise. So I encourage you to create a dialogue and some questions that you could put in your dialogue. Again, we like the faith and family approach as opposed to terminology and techniques. In fact, I heard of a charity that had sent out 35,000 planned giving surveys, and they asked questions like, how old are you? What's your net worth? How are you feeling today? No, I don't think they really said that, but that was the tone, that was the feel of it. 35,000 surveys, not a single one was returned. I'd encourage you to ask questions like, how did you first connect with our ministry? What inspired your first gift? Was there someone in your life who inspired you to get involved with us, or Ministry of the Homeless, or Christian Education, or a camp ministry? Fill in the blank with your cause. Two things. The idea is to create a dialogue, and the idea is to do it from a sense of how does their story interact with your story? Those are the best ways. So to that question earlier, someone was saying, how do I do this? How do I engage these older donors? I think these are the kind of questions that get them thinking about a legacy and about their connection to your ministry. Then I'd encourage you to keep track. Do you know who your legacy donors are? Do you have a list of all of your known legacy donors? Do you have a list of everybody who said, I would consider, I'm thinking about it? Do you have a list of people who said they're interested in leaving a legacy or getting their house in order? What you're looking at here is an example of what we do. We put them in 3 buckets. The green are your commitments, the folks who said they're in. The purple are your interest folks, the people who said, I would consider including your ministry in my will. And there's simple ways, we were looking earlier about the dialogue. A simple way that I've seen this work too is in a receipt insert. 3 questions. Please send me some information on updating my will. I would consider including your ministry in my will. I've already done it. With those 3 questions, you've captured the 3 buckets. I've already done it is your green folks. I would consider is your purple folks. I'd like more information is your orange folks. And you've got the awareness, the interest, and the action, the purple, the orange, the green, all covered with those 3 questions. All right, and then finally, what do you do with folks who said they're in? and people who you know are your known legacy donors. 3 recommendations here. I'd recommend that the big idea is that you want to continue to steward those known legacy donors. The 2 reasons I gave earlier, because their giving today can go up, their legacy gift later can go up, but you can do this through the mail. So maybe it's a once-a-year card, Christmas card, Easter card. Hey, as one of our donors who's included us in your will, we're just writing you today to say Merry Christmas, Happy Easter. A phone call, events, and we could talk a long time about events today, but what kind of events are you doing that add value? You might be doing these events already. If you're a mission and you do tours, or if you have ministry impact events, make sure those legacy donors are invited. And then finally, eyeballs, which is really shorthand for personal contact. And if I could just say a story about this here to wrap up our time. Last week, I got an email from my mother, and she said, I have a 93-year-old grandpa, and he and his wife were leaving a restaurant, again, a couple weeks ago, and they got their feet tangled up together, and they both went down. And she broke her foot, and he was pretty bruised up and banged up. And through that process, they are now moving into a living situation where they can get some more care. But in addition to that, my mom said, I'm also taking over my dad's finances. I'm going to pay his bills. I'm going to do his taxes now. I'm the executor for his estate. I'm meeting with the attorney. I have been doing that. But this is a really important thing for you to think about as a ministry, because this happens. Children take over their parents' finances in the last few years of life. And when that happens, sometimes their giving to you will slow down and even stop. Now, I said earlier their giving typically goes up, and it does. With the exception of those last few years of life, sometimes they can go down. And a mistake that you don't want to make is to lapse them or to move them off your list or to forget about them. My mom has a lot of charitable intent, but she even said, he gives all these $5 and $10 gifts to all these different charities. But if you're the child taking over finances, you're trying to simplify things. You're trying to figure out. She has a number of siblings that are interested in what's going on, and they've got to pay for assisted living. So there's just a lot of reasons to pull back on that giving. But that shouldn't be a reason for you to pull back on your communication with them, because it just might be. He might be updating his will one more time and thinking, I haven't heard from those guys in a while. Whatever, let's take them out. So we hope that doesn't happen. We pray that doesn't happen, but it's just an encouragement for you to keep the conversation going with those known legacy donors. Kristen, how are we doing here?
Hey, Doug, I think that was a great point at the end. I think that anecdotal story that is real life for your family right now is very applicable to where a lot of these ministries are. And as a development person, when you don't hear from somebody for a little bit, or that $5 check maybe doesn't come anymore, it's a good reminder to know that not only am I looking at that person as a ministry partner, but I care about them as a believer. And so I want to make sure that I'm still communicating with them and checking in on them, and purely just care about them as a person.
And thank you, because I could sound like it's all about your ministry's intent, but like if somebody called my grandpa and said, "Can we pray for you, Ken? How are you doing today?" That would go a long ways to just really loving him. I think that's the intent here, to really make that partnership real.
That's right, absolutely. Any questions from our attendees? I know there have been a few that we have not addressed, and I want you to know that your questions have been seen, and we will certainly respond to those and get that information to you. Some of them are fairly ministry specific, and then others are not, and we will, regardless, get some answers out to you quickly. Doug, any wrap-ups from your end before I make a couple of announcements?
Yeah, I'll just say, again, thank you for participating today. And as part of our gratitude for your participation, we'd like to offer you a free, two things. One, a free report. If you're interested in knowing the number of potential estate gift prospects and the value that they might be to your ministry, as well as a plan to engage them, we invite you to check out moneyforministry.com/free report. And if you fill out some information there, we'd be happy to get back with you with some information on that. And then the second thing, I mentioned our founder, President Mike. His name is Mike Buwalda. He's been doing Plan Gift Ministry for over 20 years, and he's in the process of writing a book. And we would love to give you a free sample chapter, which we can do here in the next couple of weeks. The book will be coming out probably the end of the summer, maybe early fall. He asked me to read it and edit it and offer some feedback, and I did that last week. It's an interesting read. He tells a lot of stories. He will tell the story about the auction, which I shared at the beginning, but we'd love to send you a free copy. So I think Kristen's going to send an email out at the conclusion or sometime later today, and if you reply to that, we'll get you on a list to get you a free chapter and a free book later this year.
Very good. You're exactly right, Doug. I will do that. Thank you so much for sharing with us. I don't know about the rest of the attendees. I hope they found this valuable. I know if I was sitting in that development seat, like many of you attenders are, I would feel a little bit overwhelmed, but I want you to know that you're not scaling the side of the mountain like Doug showed us in that first picture. This is a piece-by-piece, step-by-step journey, and it happens in lots of different ways. And I think that he gave us some good insight into that from a communication standpoint and from a preparedness, from just alerting your team, your leadership team, so they're aware that this is what's happening, letting your staff know that we can do these, we are getting these, sharing that as a praise. But I want to tell you what probably strikes me most from a development perspective from this conversation or this webinar is the idea of confidence. As you have conversations with people, as you have conversations with your donors, as you're communicating with them, when you mention legacy giving, it tells your donors that you're not just thinking about making budget this year or fundraising for a particular initiative. It tells your donors you're thinking about long term, that you are confident that your cause and your organization are viable for years to come, and that you are thinking that way, that you are thinking big picture, you are thinking far into the future and not just to pay tomorrow's light bill. Knowing full well, many of you may indeed be worried about your budget for the end of the month or the end of the year or for your 5-year plan. We recognize that is a real struggle sometimes, but that you are also seeing big picture and very confident in the work that you're doing. My second thought is this. It's easy to listen to these conversations and to think, yeah, when I have time. So here's what my challenge to you is to have a conversation. If you've never had this conversation before, have it this week. Have it with a safe donor, perhaps one that's given for years, perhaps one that you already have an appointment with later this week. And you can just, as part of your conversation, also mention planned giving. Or perhaps talk to a volunteer. I think a volunteer in your organization who's showing up on a regular basis is already showing great loyalty and passion, as well as commitment to your organization. Mention it to them. If you've had this conversation with a few donors, start having it with more. Just like you asked for money the first time and it was scary, and then it got easier, the same thing happens with this legacy conversation. The first one may be intimidating, but it will get easier as you include it as a part of your overall strategy in a variety of different channels, in your electronic communication, in your newsletters, and then in face-to-face conversations. You will see progress, and you will see that dial move as you continue to have the conversation and engage more folks from a legacy giving perspective. So that's my encouragement to you today. I do want to remind you we have a couple more webinars set up on the schedule, so pull out those calendars or pull them up on your computer screens. April 17th, we will be talking to Tim Smith. He is the former Chief Development Officer at Museum of the Bible, and he will be talking with us about major donor programs. He certainly has some expertise in this area, and I'm super excited to visit with him. And then again on May 15th, we will be talking probably about direct mail and how we can communicate via direct mail to our donor base. So I think that's all I have now. Be looking for emails over the next couple of days. We will make sure we get those resources to you as well as answered questions, and continue this conversation. As you hang up the phone today, tell someone about the conversation you've had. Tell someone in your organization and begin to make this part of the conversation that you have with donors. So until April 17th, when we talk about major donor planning, I just pray God's blessings on your ministry, and thank you so much for your attendance today. Bye-bye.